Hello children, welcome to my class. Today I will begin a new chapter from the book Footprints Without Feet, Supplementary Reader in English for Class 10. I will start with the first chapter called A Triumph of Surgery by James Herriot. It's a lovely, humorous story about a very lazy fat dog, Tricky, and his wealthy mistress, Mrs. Pumphrey, and her love for her pet dog, Tricky. Before I begin the chapter, let me give you a brief introduction about the author James Herriot. James Alfred White, known by pen name James Herriot, was an English veterinary surgeon and writer. He was born on 3rd October 1916 in Sunderland, England. Being a famous veterinary surgeon, he utilized his vast experience in writing stories about animals. He wrote a series of books of stories about animals and their masters. Some of his notable works are If Only They Could Talk, Every Living Thing, All Creatures Great and Small, The Best of James Herriot, James Herriot's Dog Stories. Books for children are Blossom Comes Home, The Christmas Day Kitten, Oscar Cat About Town. James Herriot died on 23rd February 1995 at the age of 78. I have collected this information from Google Wikipedia, and all the pictures that I have used in my video I have taken from Google. Thanks to Google. Let me give you the theme of the story, A Triumph of Surgery. A Triumph of Surgery is a story about a pampered and overfed dog named Tricky and his rich mistress, Mrs. Pumphrey. The dog is extremely fat. Because of his greed and too much of eating, the dog fell ill. His eyes were blood red and rheumy. Mrs. Pumphrey's excessive love and pampered made the dog sick. She couldn't understand the consequences of her blind love for her pet dog Tricky. Dr. Herriot, a veterinary surgeon, saves the life of the dog by hospitalizing him to prevent him from being overfed by his wealthy owner, who was simply worsening his condition. Today I will be giving you the summary of the story. The story started when Mrs. Pumphrey, a rich lady, took her dog Tricky out for a walk down the street. A nearby veterinary doctor, Dr. Herriot, was driving. He pulled up his car when he saw Mrs. Pumphrey with her little dog on the street. The dog looked like a blotted sausage with a leg at each end. He had blood red and rheumy eyes and was lacking energy. His tongue lolled from his jaws. Dr. Herriot was shocked to see his appearance. After inquiring from Mrs. Pumphrey about Tricky's condition, he advised her to stop giving him unhealthy things to eat between the meals. He also wanted her to make him exercise daily along with a very strict diet in order to improve his health. Mrs. Pumphrey cut down on the sweet things but relented when Tricky started getting weaker. She gave him only his favorite cream cakes and chocolates. She gave him food at odd and irregular hours. She gave him only little walks and no other exercise. Soon, Tricky fell sick and the doctor was called. Mrs. Pumphrey got determined to adhere to the doctor's stern advice. Dr. Herriot watched Tricky's progress but was not satisfied. He suggested Mrs. Pumphrey that Tricky should be kept under observation in the hospital. Mrs. Pumphrey started wailing and nearly fainted when doctor took Tricky to his hospital. Everybody in her household, including her housemaid, were in tears. Dr. Herriot took the dog along and put a bed for him in his surgery. The dog did not move much nor ate anything for the first 2 days. He did not even wag his tail or kick with his legs. His eyes, too, had become dull and he lay down motionless on the carpet. The dogs at the surgery ignored him as an uninteresting object. The doctor gave him plenty of water. On the second day, he looked around and whimpered a bit. He wanted to go out on the third day and started playing with the bigger dogs when he was taken out. He also licked the bowels of other dogs clean on the third day. Then Tricky's condition started improving very fast. He started fighting for his meals with other dogs. The doctor did not give any medicinal treatment. All day he frolicked with other dogs cheerfully. He got out of danger and started convalescing or improving rapidly. Then when this news reached Mrs. Pumphrey, she started sending him eggs as she thought that Tricky was recovering from an illness and needed energy food. Mr. Herriot and his partners started eating those eggs for morning breakfast. Then for improving Tricky's blood, Mrs. Pumphrey started sending in bottles of wine, which was again consumed by Mr. Herriot. He used to take 2 glasses before lunch and some more glasses while having his lunch. Then when Mrs. Pumphrey started sending in bottles of brandy for Tricky, that was the time when Mr. Herriot thought that he would really like to keep Tricky as a permanent guest in the surgery. Mr. Herriot used to be really happy someday by having 2 extra eggs every morning, then having few glasses of wine in the afternoon and closing the day by having brandy at night. So you can see Mr. Herriot and his partner was really having gala times, and it's only because of Mrs. Pumphrey's over-pampering nature and excessive love for her pet dog Tricky. Mrs. Pumphrey inquired about Tricky on phone many times a day. She was suffering from the pangs of a separation. Dr. Herriot took a wise decision and called up Mrs. Pumphrey as Tricky was ready to be taken back home. Mrs. Pumphrey reached the surgery by car to collect him. The doctor brought Tricky in his arms. Tricky was really happy to see his mistress and jumped into the car. Mrs. Pumphrey said that she won't be able to ever thank Dr. Herriot for what he had done, and also that his surgery had been successful, as Tricky was now cured. So children, that's all. That was the summary of the chapter A Triumph of Surgery. And in my next class, I'll explain the chapter paragraph wise.